Section 2 of 3 Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. 3 Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous in opposition to skeptics and atheists by George Berkeley. Section 2. Hyle. Look you, Philonous, you may, if you please, make a jest of my opinion, but that will not alter the truth of things. I own, indeed, the inferences you draw me into sound something oddly, but common language, you know, is framed by, and for the use of the vulgar. We must not therefore wonder if expressions adapted to exact philosophic notions seem uncouth and out of the way. Phil. Is it come to that? I assure you, I imagine myself to have gained no small point, since you make so light of departing from common phrases and opinions, it being a main part of our inquiry to examine whose notions are widest of the common road, and most repugnant to the general sense of the world. But can you think it no more than a philosophical paradox to say that real sounds are never heard, and that the idea of them is obtained by some other sense? And is there nothing in this contrary to nature and the truth of things? Hyle. To deal ingenuously, I do not like it. And, after the concessions already made, I had as well grant that sounds too have no real being without the mind. Phil. And I hope you will make no difficulty to acknowledge the same of colours. Hyle. Pardon me. The case of colours is very different. Can anything be plainer than that we see them on the objects? Phil. The objects you speak of are, I suppose, corporeal substances existing without the mind? Hyle. They are. Phil. And have true and real colours inhering in them? Hyle. Each visible object hath that colour which we see in it. Phil. How? Is there anything visible but what we perceive by sight? Hyle. There is not. Phil. And do we perceive anything by sense which we do not perceive immediately? Hyle. How often must I be obliged to repeat the same thing? I tell you we do not. Phil. Have patience, good Hylas, and tell me once more, whether there is anything immediately perceived by the senses, except sensible qualities. I know you asserted there was not, but I would now be informed whether you still persist in the same opinion. Hyle. I do. Phil. Pray, is your corporeal substance either a sensible quality, or made up of sensible qualities? Hyle. What a question that is! Whoever thought it was? Phil. My reason for asking was, because in saying, each visible object hath that colour which we see in it, you make visible objects to be corporeal substances, which implies either that corporeal substances are sensible qualities, or else that there is something besides sensible qualities perceived by sight. But, as this point was formerly agreed between us, and is still maintained by you, it is a clear consequence that your corporeal substance is nothing distinct from sensible qualities. Hyle. You may draw as many absurd consequences as you please, and endeavour to perplex the plainest things, but you shall never persuade me out of my senses. I clearly understand my own meaning. Phil. I wish you would make me understand it too. But, since you are unwilling to have your notion of corporeal substance examined, I shall urge that point no further. Only be pleased to let me know whether the same colours which we see exist in external bodies, or some other. Hyle. The very same. Phil. What? Are then the beautiful red and purple we see on yonder clouds really in them, or do you imagine they have in themselves any other form than that of a dark mist or vapour? Hyle. I must own, Philonous, those colours are not really in the clouds, as they seem to be at this distance. They are only apparent colours. Phil. Apparent call you them? How shall we distinguish these apparent colours from real? Hyle. Very easily. Those are to be thought apparent which, appearing only at a distance, vanish upon a nearer approach. Phil. And those, I suppose, are to be thought real which are discovered by the most near and exact survey? HYL. Right. PHIL. Is the nearest and exactest survey made by the help of a microscope or by the naked eye? HYL. By a microscope, doubtless. PHIL. But a microscope often discovers colours in an object different from those perceived by the unassisted sight. And, in case we had microscopes magnifying to any assigned degree, it is certain that no object whatsoever viewed through them would appear in the same colour which it exhibits to the naked eye. HYL. And what will you conclude from all this? You cannot argue that there are really and naturally no colours on objects, because by artificial managements they may be altered, or made to vanish. PHIL. I think it may evidently be concluded from your own concessions that all the colours we see with our naked eyes are only apparent as those on the clouds, since they vanish upon a more close and accurate inspection, which is afforded us by a microscope. Then, as to what you say by way of prevention, I ask you whether the real and natural state of an object is better discovered by a very sharp and piercing sight, or by one which is less sharp? HYL. By the former, without doubt. PHIL. Is it not plain from dioptrics that microscopes make the sight more penetrating, and represent objects as they would appear to the eye in case it were naturally endowed with a most exquisite sharpness? HYL. It is. PHIL. Consequently, the microscopical representation is to be thought that which best sets forth the real nature of the thing, or what it is in itself. The colours, therefore, by it perceived are more genuine and real than those perceived otherwise? HYL. I confess there is something in what you say. PHIL. Besides, it is not only possible but manifest that there actually are animals whose eyes are by nature framed to perceive those things which by reason of their minuteness escape our sight. What think you of those inconceivably small animals perceived by glasses? Must we suppose they are all stark blind? Or, in case they see, can it be imagined their sight hath not the same use in preserving their bodies from injuries, which appears in that of all other animals? And, if it hath, is it not evident they must see particles less than their own bodies, which will present them with a far different view in each object from that which strikes our own senses? Even our own eyes do not always represent objects to us after the same manner. In the jaundice, every one knows that all things seem yellow. Is it not therefore highly probable those animals in whose eyes we discern a very different texture from that of ours, and whose bodies abound with different humours, do not see the same colours in every object that we do? From all which, should it not seem to follow that all colours are equally apparent, and that none of those which we perceive are really inherent in any outward object? HYL. It should. PHIL. The point will be past all doubt, if you consider that, in case colours were real properties or affections inherent in external bodies, they could admit of no alteration without some change wrought in the very bodies themselves. But is it not evident from what hath been said that, upon the use of microscopes, upon a change happening in the burnouts of the eyes, or a variation of distance, without any manner of real alteration in the thing itself, the colours of any object are either changed or totally disappear? Nay, all other circumstances remaining the same, change but the situation of some objects, and they shall present different colours to the eye. The same thing happens upon viewing an object in various degrees of light. And what is more known than that the same bodies appear differently coloured by candle light from what they do in the open day? Add to these the experiment of a prism which, separating the heterogeneous rays of light, alters the colour of any object, and will cause the whitest to appear of a deep blue, or red to the naked eye. And now tell me whether you are still of opinion that every body hath its true real colour inhering in it. And, if you think it hath, I would fain know further from you, what certain distance and position of the object, what peculiar texture and formation of the eye, what degree or kind of light is necessary for ascertaining that true colour, and distinguishing it from apparent ones? HYL. I own myself entirely satisfied that they are all equally apparent, and that there is no such thing as colour really inhering in external bodies, but that it is altogether in the light. And what confirms me in this opinion is, that in proportion to the light colours are still more or less vivid, and if there be no light, then are there no colours perceived. Besides, allowing there are colours on external objects, yet how is it possible for us to perceive them? For no external body affects the mind, unless it acts first on our organs of sense. But the only action of bodies is motion, and motion cannot be communicated otherwise than by impulse. A distant object, therefore, cannot act on the eye, nor consequently make itself or its properties perceivable to the soul. Whence it plainly follows that it is immediately some contiguous substance, which, operating on the eye, occasions a perception of colours, and such is light. Phil. How is light then a substance? Hyl. I tell you, Philonous, external light is nothing but a thin fluid substance, whose minute particles being agitated with a brisk motion, and in various manners reflected from the different surfaces of outward objects to the eyes, communicate different motions to the optic nerves, which, being propagated to the brain, cause therein various impressions, and these are attended with the sensations of red, blue, yellow, etc. Phil. It seems then the light doth no more than shake the optic nerves. Hyl. Nothing else. Phil. And consequent to each particular motion of the nerves, the mind is affected with a sensation, which is some particular colour. Hyl. Right. Phil. And these sensations have no existence without the mind. Hyl. They have not. Phil. How then do you affirm that colours are in the light, since by light you understand a corporeal substance external to the mind? Hyl. Light and colours, as immediately perceived by us, I grant cannot exist without the mind. But in themselves they are only the motions and configurations of certain insensible particles of matter. Phil. Colours then, in the vulgar sense, or taken for the immediate objects of sight, cannot agree to any but a perceiving substance. Hyl. That is what I say. Phil. Well then, since you give up the point as to those sensible qualities which are alone thought colours by all mankind beside, you may hold what you please with regard to those invisible ones of the philosophers. It is not my business to dispute about them. Only I would advise you to bethink yourself, whether, considering the inquiry we are upon, it be prudent for you to affirm, the red and blue which we see are not real colours, but certain unknown motions and figures which no man ever did or can see are truly so. Are not these shocking notions? And are not they subject to as many ridiculous inferences as those you were obliged to renounce before in the case of sounds? Hyl. I frankly own, Philonous, that it is in vain to linger. Colours, sounds, tastes, in a word, all those termed secondary qualities, have certainly no existence without the mind. But by this acknowledgement I must not be supposed to derogate the reality of matter, or external objects, seeing it is no more than several philosophers maintain, who nevertheless are the farthest imaginable from denying matter. For the clearer understanding of this, you must know sensible qualities are by philosophers divided into primary and secondary. The former are extension, figure, solidity, gravity, motion, and rest, and these they hold exist really in bodies. The latter are those above enumerated, or, briefly, all sensible qualities beside the primary, which, they assert, are only so many sensations, or ideas existing nowhere but in the mind. But all this, I doubt not, you are apprised of. For my part, I have been a long time sensible there was such an opinion current among philosophers, but was never thoroughly convinced of its truth until now. Phil. You are still then of opinion that extension and figures are inherent in external unthinking substances? Hyl. I am. Phil. But what if the same arguments which are brought against secondary qualities will hold good against these also? Hyl. Why then I shall be obliged to think they too exist only in the mind. Phil. Is it your opinion, the very figure and extension which you perceive by sense exist in the outward object or material substance? HYL. It is. PHIL. Have all other animals as good grounds to think the same of the figure and extension which they see and feel? HYL. Without doubt, if they have any thought at all. PHIL. Answer me, Hylas. Think you the senses were bestowed upon all animals for their preservation and well-being in life, or were they given to men alone for this end? HYL. I make no question, but they have the same use in all other animals. PHIL. If so, is it not necessary they should be enabled by them to perceive their own limbs, and those bodies which are capable of harming them? HYL. Certainly. PHIL. A mite therefore must be supposed to see his own foot, and things equal or even less than it, as bodies of some considerable dimension, though at the same time they appear to you scarce discernible, or, at best, as so many visible points? HYL. I cannot deny it. PHIL. And to creatures less than the mite they will seem yet larger? HYL. They will. PHIL. Insomuch that what you can hardly discern will to another extremely minute animal appear as some huge mountain? HYL. All this I grant. PHIL. Can one in the same thing be at the same time in itself of different dimensions? HYL. That were absurd to imagine. PHIL. But, from what you have laid down, it follows that both the extension by you perceived, and that perceived by the mite itself, as likewise all those perceived by lesser animals, are each of them the true extension of the mite's foot; that is to say, by your own principles you are led into an absurdity. HYL. There seems to be some difficulty in the point. PHIL. Again, have you not acknowledged that no real inherent property of any object can be changed without some change in the thing itself? HYL. I have. PHIL. But, as we approach to or recede from an object, the visible extension varies, being at one distance 10 or 100 times greater than another. Doth it not therefore follow from hence likewise that it is not really inherent in the object? HYL. I own I am at a loss what to think. PHIL. Your judgment will soon be determined, if you will venture to think as freely concerning this quality as you have done concerning the rest. Was it not admitted as a good argument that neither heat nor cold was in the water, because it seemed warm to one hand and cold to the other? HYL. It was. PHIL. Is it not the very same reasoning to conclude there is no extension or figure in an object, because to one eye it shall seem little, smooth, and round, when at the same time it appears to the other great, uneven, and regular? HYL. The very same. But does this latter fact ever happen? PHIL. You may at any time make the experiment, by looking with one eye bare, and with the other through a microscope. HYL. I know not how to maintain it, and yet I am loath to give up extension. I see so many odd consequences following upon such a concession. PHIL. Odd, say you? After the concessions already made, I hope you will stick at nothing for its oddness. But, on the other hand, should it not seem very odd, if the general reasoning, which includes all other sensible qualities, did not also include extension? If it be allowed that no idea, nor anything like an idea, can exist in an unperceiving substance, then surely it follows that no figure or mode of extension, which we can either perceive, or imagine, or have any idea of, can be really inherent in matter. Not to mention the peculiar difficulty there must be in conceiving a material substance prior to and distinct from extension to be the substratum of extension. Be the sensible quality what it will, figure, or sound, or colour, it seems alike impossible it should subsist in that which doth not perceive it. HYL. I give up the point for the present, preserving still a right to retract my opinion, in case I shall hereafter discover any false step in my progress to it. PHIL. That is a right you cannot be denied. Figures and extension being dispatched, we proceed next to motion. can a real motion in any external body be at the same time very swift and very slow? HYL. It cannot. PHIL. Is not the motion of a body swift in a reciprocal proportion to the time it takes up in describing any given space? Thus, a body that describes a mile in an hour moves 3 times faster than it would in case it described only a mile in 3 hours? HYL. I agree with you. PHIL. It is not time measured by the succession of ideas in our minds? HYL. It is. PHIL. And is it not possible ideas should succeed one another twice as fast in your mind as they do in mine, or in that of some spirit of another kind? HYL. I own it. PHIL. Consequently, the same body may to another seem to perform its motion over any space in half the time that it does to you. And the same reasoning will hold as to any other proportion. That is to say, according to your principles, (since the motions perceived are both really in the object), it is possible one and the same body shall be really moved the same way at once, both very swiftly and very slow. How is this consistent either with common sense, or with what you just now granted? HYL. I have nothing to say to it. PHIL. Then, as for solidity, either you do not mean any sensible quality by that word, and so it is beside our inquiry; or, if you do, it must be either hardness or resistance; but both the one and the other are plainly relative to our senses, it being evident that what seems hard to one animal may appear soft to another, who hath greater force and firmness of limbs. Nor is it less plain that the resistance I feel is not in the body. HYL. I own the very sensation of resistance, which is all you immediately perceive, is not in the body, but the cause of that sensation is. PHIL. But the causes of our sensations are not things immediately perceived, and therefore are not sensible. This point I thought had been already determined. HYL. I own it was; but you will pardon me if I seem a little embarrassed. I know not how to quit my old notions. PHIL. To help you out, do but consider that if extension be once acknowledged to have no existence without the mind, the same must necessarily be granted of motion, solidity, and gravity, since they all evidently suppose extension. It is therefore superfluous to inquire particularly concerning each of them. In denying extension, you have denied them all to have any real existence. HYL. I wonder, Philonous, if what you say be true. Why those philosophers who deny the secondary qualities any real existence should yet attribute it to the primary. If there is no difference between them, how can this be accounted for? PHIL. It is not my business to account for every opinion of the philosophers; but, among other reasons which may be assigned for this, it seems probable that pleasure and pain, being rather annexed to the former than the latter, may be one. Heat and cold, tastes and smells, have something more vividly pleasing or disagreeable than the ideas of extension, figure, and motion affect us with. And, it being too visibly absurd to hold that pain or pleasure can be in an unperceiving substance, men are more easily weaned from believing the external existence of the secondary than the primary qualities. You will be satisfied there is something in this, if you recollect the difference you made between an intense and more moderate degree of heat, allowing the one a real existence, while you denied it to the other. But, after all, there is no rational ground for that distinction; for, surely an indifferent sensation is as truly a sensation as one more pleasing or painful, and consequently should not any more than they be supposed to exist in an unthinking subject. HYL. It has just come into my head, Philonous, that I have somewhere heard of a distinction between absolute and sensible extension. Now, though it be acknowledged that great and small, consisting merely in the relation which other extended beings have to the parts of our own bodies, do not really inhere in the substances themselves, yet nothing obliges us to hold the same with regard to absolute extension, which is something abstracted from great and small, from this or that particular magnitude or figure. So likewise as to motion, swift and slow are altogether relative to the succession of ideas in our own minds, But it doth not follow, because those modifications of motion exist not without the mind, and therefore absolute motion abstracted from them doth not. PHIL. Pray, what is it that distinguishes one motion, or one part of extension, from another? Is it not something sensible, as some degree of swiftness or slowness, some certain magnitude or figure peculiar to each? HYL. I think so. PHIL. These qualities, therefore, stripped of all sensible properties, are without all specific numerical differences, as the schools call them? HYL. They are. PHIL. That is to say, they are extension in general, and motion in general? HYL. Let it be so. PHIL. But it is a universally received maxim that everything which exists is particular. How then can motion in general, or extension in general, exist in any corporeal substance? HYL. I will take time to solve your difficulty. PHIL. But I think the point may be speedily decided. Without doubt you can tell whether you are able to frame this or that idea. Now I am content to put our dispute on this issue. If you can frame in your thoughts a distinct abstract idea of motion or extension, divested of all those sensible modes, as swift and slow, great and small, round and square, and the like, which are acknowledged to exist only in the mind, I will then yield the point you contend for. But if you cannot, it will be unreasonable on your side to insist any longer upon what you have no notion of. HYL. To confess ingenuously, I cannot. PHIL. Can you even separate the ideas of extension and motion from the ideas of all those qualities which they who make the distinction term secondary? HYL. What? Is it not an easy matter to consider extension and motion by themselves, extracted from all other sensible qualities? Pray how do the mathematicians treat of them? PHIL. I acknowledge, Hylas, it is not difficult to form general propositions and reasonings about those qualities, without mentioning any other, and, in this sense, to consider or treat of them abstractedly. But how doth it follow that, because I can pronounce the word motion by itself, I can form the idea of it in my mind exclusive of body? Or, because theorems may be made of extension and figures, without any mention of great or small, or any other sensible mode or quality, that therefore it is possible such an abstract idea of extension, without any particular size or figure, or sensible quality, should be distinctly formed and apprehended by the mind? Mathematicians treat of quantity, without regarding what other sensible qualities it is attended with, as being altogether indifferent to their demonstrations. But, when laying aside the words, they contemplate the bare ideas. I believe you will find they are not the pure abstracted ideas of extension. HYL. But what say you to pure intellect? May not abstracted ideas be framed by that faculty? PHIL. Since I cannot frame abstract ideas at all, it is plain I cannot frame them by the help of pure intellect. Whatsoever faculty you understand by those words. Besides, not to inquire into the nature of pure intellect and its spiritual objects, as virtue, reason, God, or the like, thus much seems manifest, that sensible things are only to be perceived by senses, or represented by the imagination. Figures, therefore, and extension, being originally perceived by sense, do not belong to pure intellect. But, for your farther satisfaction, try if you can frame the idea of any figure, abstracted from all particularities of size, or even from other sensible qualities. HYL. Let me think a little. I do not find that I can. PHIL. And can you think it possible that should really exist in nature which implies a repugnancy in its conception? HYL. By no means. PHIL. Since therefore it is impossible even for the mind to disunite the ideas of extension and motion from all other sensible qualities, does it not follow that where the one exists, there necessarily the other exists likewise? HYL. It should seem so. PHIL. Consequently, the very same arguments which you admitted as conclusive against the secondary qualities are, without any farther application of force, against the primary too? Besides, if you will trust your senses, is it not plain all sensible qualities coexist, or to them appear as being in the same place? do they ever represent a motion or figure as being divested of all other visible and tangible qualities? HYL. You need say no more on this head. I am free to own, if there be no secret error or oversight in our proceedings hitherto, that all sensible qualities are alike to be denied existence without the mind. But my fear is that I have been too liberal in my former concessions, or overlooked some fallacy or other. In short, I did not take time to think. PHIL. For that matter, Hylas, you may take what time you please in reviewing the progress of our inquiry. You are at liberty to recover any slips you might have made, or offer whatever you have omitted which makes for your first opinion. HYL. One great oversight I take to be this, that I did not sufficiently distinguish the object from the sensation. Now, though this latter may not exist without the mind, yet it will not thence follow that the former cannot. PHIL. What object do you mean? The object of the senses? HYL. The same. PHIL. It is then immediately perceived? HYL. Right. PHIL. Make me to understand the difference between what is immediately perceived and a sensation. HYL. The sensation I take to be an act of the mind perceiving, besides which there is something perceived, and this I call the object. For example, there is red and yellow on that tulip, but then the act of perceiving those colours is in me only, and not in the tulip. PHIL. What tulip do you speak of? Is it that which you see? HYL. The same. PHIL. And what do you see beside colour, figure, and extension? HYL. Nothing. PHIL. What you would say then is that the red and yellow are coexistent with the extension, is it not? HYL. That is not all. I would say they have a real existence without the mind in some unthinking substance. PHIL. That the colours are really in the tulip, which I see is manifest. Neither can it be denied that this tulip may exist independent of your mind or mine. But that any immediate object of the senses, that is, any idea or combination of ideas, should exist in an unthinking substance, or exterior to all minds, is in itself an evident contradiction. Nor can I imagine how this follows from what you said just now, to wit, that the red and yellow were on the tulip you saw, since you do not pretend to see that unthinking substance. HYL. You have an artful way, Philonous, of diverting our inquiry from the subject. PHIL. I see you have no mind to be pressed that way. To return then to your distinction between sensation and object, if I take you right, you distinguish in every perception two things, the one an action of the mind, the other not. HYL. True. PHIL. And this action cannot exist in, or belong to, any unthinking thing, but whatever beside is implied in a perception may? HYL. That is my meaning. PHIL. So that if there was a perception without any act of mind, it were possible such a perception should exist in an unthinking substance? HYL. I grant it, but it is impossible there should be such a perception. PHIL. When is the mind said to be active? HYL. When it produces, puts an end to, or changes anything. PHIL. Can the mind produce, discontinue, or change anything but by an act of the will? HYL. It cannot. PHIL. The mind therefore is to be accounted active in its perception so far forth as volition is included in them? HYL. It is. PHIL. In plucking this flower I am active, because I do it by the motion of my hand, which was consequent upon my volition. So likewise in applying it to my nose. But is either of these smelling? HYL. No. PHIL. I act too in drawing the air through my nose, because breathing so, rather than otherwise, is the effect of my volition. But neither can this be called smelling, for, if it were, I should smell every time I breathed in that manner. HYL. True. PHIL. Smelling then is somewhat consequent to all this? HYL. It is. PHIL. But I do not find my will concerned any farther. Whatever more there is, as that I perceive such a particular smell, or any smell at all, this is independent of my will, and therein I am altogether passive. Do you find it otherwise with you, Hylas? HYL. No, the very same. PHIL. Then, as to seeing, is it not in your power to open your eyes, or keep them shut? to turn them this way or that? HYL. Without doubt. PHIL. But does it in like manner depend on your will that in looking on this flower you perceive white rather than any other colour? Or, directing your open eyes toward yonder part of the heaven, can you avoid seeing the sun? Or is light or darkness the effect of your volition? HYL. No, certainly. PHIL. You are then in these respects altogether passive? HYL. I am. PHIL. Tell me now, whether seeing consists in perceiving light and colours, or in opening and turning the eyes? HYL. Without doubt in the former. PHIL. Since therefore you are in the very perception of light and colours altogether passive, what is become of that action you were speaking of as an ingredient in every sensation? And does it not follow from your own concessions that the perception of light and colours, including no action in it, may exist in an unperceiving substance? And is not this a plain contradiction? HYL. I know not what to think of it. PHIL. Besides, since you distinguish the active and passive in every perception, you must do it in that of pain. But how is it possible that pain, be it as little active as you please, should exist in an unperceiving substance? In short, do but consider the point, and then confess ingenuously, whether light and colours, tastes, sounds, etc., are not all equally passions or sensations in the soul. You may indeed call them external objects, and give them in words what subsistence you please, but examine your own thoughts, and then tell me whether it be not as I say. HYL. I acknowledge, Philonous, that upon a fair observation of what passes in my mind, I can discover nothing else but that I am a thinking being, affected with variety of sensations. Neither is it possible to conceive how a sensation should exist in an unperceiving substance. But then, on the other hand, when I look on sensible things in a different view, considering them as so many modes and qualities, I find it necessary to suppose a material substratum, without which they cannot be conceived to exist. End of section 2. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards.